let's go ahead and dive into today's topic. Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bien Fingoy. I will be host for today. Felix, the current host, is currently busy with family problem, family issue. We wish him a speedy recovery. And so let's go ahead and dive into it. Today's topic, we're going to be focusing on climate change. Climate change and what is climate change? We want our viewers to understand what is climate change, what's the impact of climate change on a planet, and especially on the continent of Africa. And why should Africans even care about it? Should we care about climate change? Why are not black people in general really not having this conversation about climate change? So I'm going to go ahead and introduce my panel here today. I'm on the far back over there, I have my brother Alvis Darko, if you want to scoot in and just...
okay.
Yeah.
Hey people, how you guys doing today? Yes.
And then right in the middle, we have a very special guest. I don't want to mess up her name, so I'm going to let her introduce herself, but she's a PhD student in environmental sustainability studies, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
So my name is Sarah Takola, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect. And then right here, go ahead, brother.
You don't know my name? Hi everybody, you know me already. This is David, and it's another time on Russia Africa. So we're just about to talk about global warming, right?
Yes, we're about to talk about global warming, and so my first question, to you gentlemen, is what is your definition of global warming? I know the general definition, but I want to know what is your guys' definition for global warming. I'm gonna start off with David.
Pretty much, I will sum it up. I think global warming is the changes in our environment caused by human action to interfere with the normal environment. Anything that changes the status quo in the environment due to human action, especially with the weather, rainfall, snow, those patterns, anything that changes or interferes in the normal flow of that change, that is global warming.
That is global warming.
Yeah.
Okay, and what about you? We know the general definition was but from your perspective, what do you think? If you can simplify the definition for people who are listening who don't know what global warming is, because there's a lot of definition on it. What would you put it as?
I would say it's basically the result of too much pollution and overconsumption of everything on the earth and all of the resources, and it's causing specifically greenhouse gases like CO2, which comes out when you're driving a car or burning fossil fuels. It's actually causing the temperatures to rise in the atmosphere, which is making major changes to everything from hurricanes and storm surges to increased droughts and famines.
What about you, Elvis?
Pretty much a combination of what both of them said. It's the change in weather, change in temperature, change in pretty much the sustainability of life here on planet Earth. That's what I believe global warming is everything just getting hotter.
Okay. Everything's getting hotter.
Everything's getting hotter.
See, the reason why I want to talk about today this topic, because last Friday there was a huge strike globally wise, and it was led by particularly youth.
It's led by Thunberg, Greta Thunberg.
Greta Thunberg.
Yeah,
But majority of participants were youth participating about global warming and trying to raise awareness to the whole world and demanding that the government, the people in power, to do something about the crisis that we're facing on, and their future, our future basically, is depending on reversing the course of global warming if it's not too late already. So on that note, my question to you guys, what do you guys see the black community, the African community, why are we not engaging in the global warming as the rest of the world or as the rest of the population tend to focus on? Any of you guys get into the kid?
You wanna take this one?
Sure. So I think in the way that global warming is usually talked about is in usually big scientific terms, and then they say that it's going to impact polar bears and these other things, and so it's really become this white middle class issue. But I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that scientists don't know how to communicate. Speaking, as a PhD student who, is developing to be a scientist and have to work with scientists, they suck at talking to humans. Straight up, like they don't know how to do it, and so they've made the conversation really inaccessible. However, people of color, especially Black and African folks, we know these things are affecting us. In fact, my father is actually, in a way, he's a climate refugee from Ethiopia, and this happened in I believe it was like 78. It was the year when they took out Haile Selassie from power, and there was what they called the Red Terror, and they were killing people, and so my dad left, and so the way he saw it, he was running away from communism, but the way I saw it when I seen what happened is in large part this caused the destruction of the empire was because of the famine, and that's when a lot of people think about, the starving Ethiopians, that famine, though, they found was actually connected to pollution for Britain. And so even though Ethiopia was never colonized, their last king was in part taken out because of what Britain did, because of their pollution. And so when we look at what is happening, it's the rich white people and the northerners are using all of these resources and creating all this pollution, and us as Black people and in Africa, they're dying first. They're the ones being impacted by these famines and these droughts and all of these things. And so when we frame it like this is killing us first. And so we should care about it more than anybody else, because we're going to die first. And so right now they're having a lot of conversations and they're making decisions about our lives. And if we're not involved in that conversation, what are they going to do? They already done it. They've made Africa a sacrifice zone. Even in the targets that the United Nations is doing in the global climate negotiations, they're making targets that basically are going to sacrifice the whole sub-Saharan Africa. Targets when you're no longer going to be able to grow food on the land, and that's when they're starting, because that's when the north starts to be, the western countries start to be impacted. So they're saying, 2 degrees of warming is where we should do it. But actually, I was in Paris the day that when the climate negotiations were happening, when they signed the Paris Treaty, and we were there with many other African folks and folks from small island nations, and our demand was 1.5 degrees of warming, but 1.5 to stay alive. And so even the targets they're making, which they often, you could take all of Africa's delegates, they have less than the United States delegates.
That's
very
insane.
With one country compared to a whole continent. And so we're not being brought to the table in the same ways that these Western countries are, and that's why we should care.
So to tag upon what you said, that's why we should care, David. From your perspective, do you think Africans should really care about the global warming? Like she mentioned, if the delegates from the United States are more than the delegate from the continent, which kind of tells you our voice never, meaning they don't want us to the table, or our voice is not really counting. Should Africans care about global warming from your perspective?
Global warming mostly is caused by the most industrialized countries, and China and the US lead in terms of the pollution. And the US and China that produce most of the pollution, and I think Trump just got out of the Paris Accord. So he's no more joining the climate change. So I think we as Africans, and I think people in the US and the Western world, they are more enlightened about global warming than Africa, because I think it's more of a westernized problem, because global warming in the US here, I think it's a Democrats' agenda, It's, the only time you see people talking about climate change or global warming is progressive Democrats making it their political agenda, and I think since Black people subscribe to the Democrat Party, that's why most people, Blacks in the US here, and all of us immigrants, even global warming is a household word in the US here. You say that and everybody knows global warming. But in Africa, I think although global warming activity, the whole world is a global village now. So the activities of the US can change the status or the rainfall pattern, the climate in Ghana or anywhere in Africa, because it's all interrelated. So in that sense, we're supposed to care. But the people there, I think, have other issues to tend to care about. You know, like if you look at the pyramid of needs, as I always say, our people are still down there not finding even food to eat. Although this same food that they are not finding, I think sometimes is impacted by global warming. But the people are not aware, you know. So I think it's not that like black and white situation where you could say the people in Africa should care about global warming or they shouldn't care. I think it's a gray area. So with time, if the people are able to achieve their basic needs, then these things, in school, in high school, we used to write about global warming and everything, but it was just in the academic sector. If I go home, nobody talks about global warming, or it's not a household word like in
It's
the
not
US.
household conversation.
Yeah, like the US here, you know. We see politicians on the biggest platform talking about global warming, you see, but not in Africa. No politician will mount the stage in Africa to talk about global warming.
So from what I'm understanding from you is that on the continent of Africa, majority of people, they see global warming as a first party conversation, first party problem, other than more like their own conversation. Because I think here in the States, you hear global warming pretty much in every conversation that you can. Now it has becoming like the mainstream popular conversation to have as far as political goes wise. You know, people want to know your opinion on global warming, you know, versus what you mentioned in Africa. That
The
just kinda
politicians,
heavy.
yeah, but the politicians don't even talk about
The
it.
politicians don't even talk about that. So, my
To,
phone.
to me, it sounds like an issue, as David David earlier said, it's a political agenda by the Democrats. And I mean, in terms of the Democrats being the forerunners on this issue, is definitely true. Just because Republicans, like especially farmers and people like that, they don't want to admit that global warming is actually taking place. They won't admit, they won't even use the words global warming apparently.
Climate change.
Yeah, they won't even use that word. They would probably just say, oh yeah, it's getting hotter. But they don't want to admit to the fact that they are losing crops. Currently in other states, they're losing crops. Their money's been affected. We're being affected, you know, and definitely Africa is being affected. But it sounds like everybody then on the. I want to say there seems to be a spectrum on the. I mean, it seems to be an issue on the Republican spectrum because.
So, I was not to cut you off, but
I mean,
I think what you are saying. I mean, my question to follow up what you are saying. What I'm getting from you is that farmers should be the people pushing global warming because they can see the impact directly right away.
It's not just that. I mean, we should all be concentrating on global warming. Farmers are the ones producing the food for us. We're the ones eating the food. So if we're not protesting to say, hey, this is what's happening, then how are they supposed to notice that this is, you know, do you guys understand me? So for me, it's an issue that I mean, I totally disagree with David. We should all be mindful of it. And my question is, how are we supposed to make Africans mindful of it? And I'm glad that when they were doing the protest, a few African countries did join. So that was definitely a blessing to see. So it sounds like what this young individual, what are we adults doing around, just walking around, not doing anything? I'm glad she made such she's taking such an action because, yeah, these countries are facing drought, it's getting hotter, and as you stated earlier, it's like it should be about 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that's not what we're living up to. So it's something that we all need to be mindful of. It doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican, as long as we are human beings living on this earth, we are affecting everything that's around us. I used to go hiking. You go hiking, you get on top of the mountain, you look all around you, there is pollution everywhere. And this is just in the Phoenix, the city of Phoenix. So yeah, it's something that we all need to pay attention to because it's just not here in Arizona.
So to follow up, so far what I'm understanding is we should be having this conversation more often about global warming. And you mentioned earlier that people who have been fighting about global warming and warning us, many scientists, and they're not business people, quote unquote, they don't know how to sell the propaganda or
The message.
the message properly to convey the message properly to the massive, so even a person, a farmer, can fully understand how that's going to impact them in the future. So how do we have those conversations with the youth here, and primarily people in Africa, where, like David mentioned, they have bigger issues. The first thing they're worrying about is the basic needs. You know, I don't have no light bulb in my house. You know, I have to use a torch when I'm doing farming in the night, or whatever the situation might be. You know, how do we have those conversations with people to educate them or inform them about global warming? Anybody wanna?
For me, it takes place, or it kind of starts off with kind of how Greta started it. If people don't voice out, how are we supposed to know? So if people in Africa don't voice out and make statements, how are the citizens supposed to know? How is this whole entire Paris Accord supposed to affect us? That's what we need to be saying. That's what we need to be making clear, is that we are people too. We are being affected by it. We need to have a voice in this. But Africa is just thinking about the small things that are being affected, but aren't mindful to what's actually really going on with those small things. So we need to voice it out. That's how we take approach.
So, do you have any other suggestion on how to go about having this conversation with?
Yeah. So, like I said, I think that one of the biggest problems is the way that it's being framed. You know. And so yes, it is indeed a nightmare, and people are already dying from this. However, we need to frame it in potential. There's actually a potential to change our society, to actually address the inequalities and inequities, and to create a healthier society. And so we can focus on the jobs that can be created if we do change our society, if we do change everything. You know, here in the United States, they're talking about the Green New Deal a lot, and how we're going to create millions of green jobs and make sure that the communities who are most impacted, so Black and brown communities, get the jobs, as well as the folks who are currently in the fossil fuel industry. These are the people who get those jobs first and get the training as well. In Africa, I think it's really important